So, at this point in the course, if you're following along with the Cartesian epistemology project, which is to start with the presupposition that all we've got access to is our own inner mental states, and we have to build up to the external world. And that's what the sense data theorists are trying to do. That's what Bertrand Russell's up to, trying to explain how, given that we can only access our own inner mental imagery, how do we end up with knowledge of the external world? But like I say, if you're following along with this thought process, it's going to start to occur to many of you, like, how do I know there's anything out there? How do I know there is an external world? Especially after reading Descartes, hearing about Descartes, and the idea that, well, we might be dreaming. Our entire existence up to this point could have been a dream. So every single image you think you've ever seen of an external world has been an illusion. There's just nothing out there. It's just your mind making that stuff up. Or maybe there's another powerful being that's feeding you this stream of images. These kind of skeptical worries can lead a person to doubt the reality of the external world. Now, I want to re-emphasize the point again, which I've made several times, and I keep making it, and people always forget it, but it's worth repeating. Raising the specter of doubt about the external world is not the same thing as showing that it doesn't exist at all. What we are involved in doing is not proving that the external world doesn't exist, but the skeptic is trying to raise these considerations intended to show that we don't know that it's there. So we're left in the state of not knowing that the external world is there. It might be there, but the worry is we just don't know that it's there. So now enter G.E. Moore, who is going to prove that there is an external world. I'm walking in Cambridge today, by the way, and it's cold out, but it's nice to get out of the house, so I'm not complaining. So the reading that we did is just 3 pages long, I think. It's part of a longer paper, but the point of the argument, the whole argument is very to the, I was going to say to the point. It's short and sweet, it's concise, it's snarky, it's sort of absurd, but also powerful. And it, in effect, I think it ushered in, this way of thinking about things, ushered in a whole revolution, sort of, in the philosophical discourse. What they call the Age of Moore. So the argument has 2 premises and a conclusion. Premise 1 is, here's a hand. Premise 2 is, here's another hand. The conclusion is, at least 2 things exist in the external world, 2 hands, 2 human hands. So, QED, there must be at least 2 things that you know that there are. Those aren't mental images. In other words, those are your hands. You know that your hands exist. So you know that there's an external world. Now, is this immediately convincing? A lot of people are going to say, wait, your proof that there's an external world is to say, here's a hand, here's another hand, but that doesn't get us anywhere. So Moore's immediate next move is to say, okay, I know some of you are going to be thinking this is a bad proof, but why? What's wrong with it? The question is there something wrong with the argument? And he starts to address that. Moore starts to address the question by saying, what makes a good argument? What goes into making something a good argument? If we can get a list of necessary and sufficient conditions, then we can check to see if this argument meets them. And if it does, then it's a good argument. Okay, so what are the 3? He gives us 3 conditions. What are they? And by the way, I'm just getting to the Cambridge Public Library, so that's where we're gonna talk. It's a little crowded in here, so I have to keep my distance from people. Hopefully they're all keeping their distance from each other. Okay, the first condition is that the premises of the argument not be identical with the conclusion. If your premises of your argument are identical with the conclusion, that's what they call a question-begging argument. That just assumes the conclusion in the premises. Condition 1. Condition 2, that the premises are known. And condition 3 is that the that the conclusion follows from the premises. The premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. That's a way of saying, in logic ease, that the argument is valid, logically valid. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That's what it is for the conclusion to follow from the premises. My plan is to just wander around in circles outside of this building. This is the Cambridge Public Library, main branch. It's like I think it's like an award-winning architecture situation. All right. So now what we need to do is check, does the argument satisfy these 3 conditions on being a good proof? Condition 1 is that the premises are distinct from the conclusion. So, reminder, premise 1, here's a hand. Premise 2, here's another hand. Conclusion, there are at least 2 hands. So, Moore points out that neither of the premises by themselves entails the conclusion. This is just math. One hand, premise 1, doesn't entail that there are 2 hands, conclusion. So they're logically distinct. He's not begging the question. That's part of what's clever and snarky about the proof. The fact that there are 2 premises, here's one hand, here's another hand. It would be question begging if the argument was, here's a hand, therefore there's a hand. Conclusion would be the same thing as the premise. But in his form of the argument, neither of the 2 premises entails the conclusion. Okay, so check first box. The premises are distinct from the conclusion, not question-begging argument. Not question-begging in the classic sense, anyway. So there's another sense that some people might have that in some sense he's begging the question, but that's something we have to get into. Like, in what sense is he begging the question? Not in the traditional sense of an argument which has as its premise the conclusion itself. Second condition on a good argument, necessary condition, is that we have to know the premise. Do we know that here's a hand? Is this something that's known? Do we know that here's another hand? So I think this might be the place where he makes his biggest breakthrough in thinking about this question. So he says, yeah, of course I know that this is a hand. It's absurd to think that I don't know that I have a hand here. It's one of the most obvious truths in the whole world. It's staring me right in the face. How could anyone doubt that they know that they have hands? So the answer here, he's just sort of sticking it to the philosophical skeptic who says, how do I really know that there's hands? He's like, this is the most obvious thing we've got. If we don't know this, we don't know anything. This is the number one thing that we know. So there's a serious philosophical question here, and it's going to come up again when we start talking about Lorraine Coates' work in the second part of the epistemology unit. But the idea is, well, we're picking exemplars of knowledge. We have to pick what are the paradigm cases. What is a good example of knowledge? If anything is a good example of knowledge, the fact that I have a hand is something, I mean, that's a very plausible candidate for something that I know. So, okay, we're going to keep elaborating on this point. He gets back into it when he raises some further objections. But so, at this point, the idea is, well, he thinks he's shown, if there's any 2 premises I know, it's here's a hand, here's another hand. And so, if he's right, if we do know that we have 2 hands, we know here's a hand, we know here's a hand, then check the second condition. In other words, we know the premises are true. I guess I'll walk down toward Harvard. Okay, so third condition is that the conclusion follows from the premises. That is, there are 2 human hands in existence follows from here's a hand plus here's another hand. Again, this is just a trivial result. It follows that there are two things, two hands, if premise 1 is here's one hand and premise 2 is here's another hand. So check box number 3. So it satisfies all 3 necessary conditions, and then the idea is that those 3 conditions are sufficient for it to count as a strong argument, good argument. But there still seems to be something weird about it. How can you know that the external world exists just on the basis of this argument? It seems like something is going wrong. Some tricky business is happening. Something, you're pulling a fast one more. I think I forgot to mention, I don't know, I can't remember exactly where this falls in the slides, but he gives further support for this type of argument being a good one. He says, we use arguments like this all the time and we accept them. And his example is one where he says, suppose that I say there are 3 typos on page 12 of your manuscript, and you say, prove it to me. Then he goes and finds the 3. He's like, here's one, here's another one, and here's a third one. Therefore, there are 3 typos on the 3rd page of your manuscript. He's like, this is an ordinarily perfect proof of the claim that there are 3 typos. So why shouldn't it be the case that the hand premises similarly prove that there are 2 hands? Okay, so now, right, we're trying to go at this in waves, in a sense, sort of establishing the bare minimums, and then challenging the person who says, yeah, but there's something funny about this argument. Challenge him to say, what is funny about the argument? Explain what's wrong with this argument, because it seems perfectly reasonable. I know that here's a hand, I know that here's a hand, so I know 2 hands exist. Where am I going wrong? So Moore writes, I'm perfectly aware that there will be philosophers who think that something's wrong with this proof. But what is it that they wanted proved exactly? What did they want? So he goes through 2 objections. That's basically the end of the reading that we had. I mean, it was a short reading for us. I think I can cover it just in this one walk. So these are the 2 sort of more sophisticated objections, attempts to say what is going wrong with this argument, what's so fishy about it. So objection 1, he speaks in the voice of his critic. He says to himself, you haven't proved the truth of the premises. You haven't proved that there's a hand here. I mean, you showed me one, but you haven't proved that it's there with absolute certainty. And his reply to this is in keeping with the defense of the idea that the argument satisfies the 2nd necessary condition on a good argument, that he knows that he has hands. He says, right, I agree. I haven't proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I have a hand in front of me. And he refers to Descartes too. He says, if I was going to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's a hand here, I'd have to prove somehow that I'm not dreaming. I'd have to prove that I'm not being deceived by an evil demon. And he says, I can't do that, and nobody can do that. We can't prove anything like that beyond a shadow of a doubt. But he says, I still have conclusive evidence that there's a hand here. I mean, I have all the evidence you could possibly want, that you could possibly get. I have all the evidence that you could possibly have for the claim that there's a hand here. So I must know it. I mean, if I know anything at all, I know this. I said that before. But the way that I think about it, I think the way to address the worry, this is the way I understand it. Think back to the claim that we talked about a while ago in the first video, Descartes' definition of knowledge. Knowledge requires certainty. What is the status of that hypothesis? How certain are we that that's true? Do we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that knowledge requires certainty? I mean, where did we get that justification? It's a kind of conceptual analysis maybe or something, but when I think about Moore's argument, the way that I understand it is the claim that I know that I have a hand is more certain than the claim that knowledge requires 100% certainty. That's kind of an abstract metaphysical question, whether or not knowledge requires absolute certainty. I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I'm much more sure that I know that I have a hand. So if the presupposition, if the definition of knowledge rules out this claim that I know that I have a hand, then my response, and I think Moore's response, is something has gone wrong with the definition of knowledge. You're asking too much, because this is the sort of most straightforward case that we can think of something that you know. So if your definition of knowledge rules out the best, most obvious case of knowledge, it's not that you don't know, it's that your definition of knowledge has to go. So we need a different definition of knowledge, one that doesn't require absolute certainty. All right, so just to recap that line of thought, the objection was raised, well, you haven't proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that you know your premises. His response is, I agree, I haven't proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I know it anyway, and any definition of knowledge that says that I don't know that I have hands must be thrown out. So I said before that this was a sort of revolution in philosophical thinking. The idea, the Morean revolution, More's approach is to say, sometimes common sense should outweigh philosophical thought experiments or something like that. Like, commonsensically, I know that I have a hand. Yes, you can conjure these fears of that I maybe haven't dreamed my whole life, or that I have been deceived by an evil demon. But don't let that get in the way of remembering your common sense knowledge. Like, you can lay claim to these common sense knowledge claims, and in fact the philosopher has to respect them. If the philosopher is not respecting what is known through common sense, the sort of burden of proof is on them. Okay, so now I'm not saying that this is the ultimate gambit in all philosophy. I mean, a lot of people have been moved toward making common sense the starting point of philosophy by More. And I do think that there's a lot to be said for it, and it's a pretty important perspective to have. But I still do think, just for the record, that philosophical arguments can challenge common sense. And it's not like everyone automatically knows everything without thinking hard about it. So I think that sometimes philosophy can overturn common sense, but sometimes common sense functions as a check on philosophical thinking. I'm gonna leave the Harvard campus in a second, head back toward where are we going? I don't know, I'm just wandering around. Okay, so that's how he raises the first objection that challenges the proof on the grounds he doesn't know the premises. Then the second objection challenges the proof on the grounds that you can't have a good proof if you haven't proved the premises. This is like a kind of hard distinction to keep in mind. So I'm just going to repeat it one more time. Objection 1 is that he doesn't know the premises are true. Because he hasn't proved it. Sorry, it's kind of windy. So objection 1 is an objection to the claim that we know the premises are true. It says that those premises can't be known without a proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. Moore says, no, we can know things without a proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. The second objection targets the claim that the argument is good if it satisfies those 3 necessary conditions. So objection 2 basically targets the idea that that he's gotten the right analysis of a good argument. It wants to add a 4th condition. We need a 4th necessary condition on having an acceptable argument. And that necessary condition is you have to have proved your premises. You have to have a proof for each of your premises, or else the argument is bogus. Okay, and simply put, I mean, he says that's not the case. So he argues, I mean, he wants to make the case that we don't need to prove the premises are true in order to have a good proof. The way that a proof works in general is, it says if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Or if the premises are known, then you can know the conclusion. So if you know the premises, then you can know the conclusion. So his response is something like that. You say, well, I'm not 100% certain that I know that the premises are true, but that fact doesn't undermine the validity of the argument, and it doesn't show that it's not a good proof. It shows that, if I actually happen to be deceived, if it's actually not the case that I have hands, and I don't know that I have hands in that case, because knowledge requires truth, in that case, the argument fails. But that doesn't show in itself that it's a bad argument. A good argument could still go wrong if it turns out that you don't know the premises. He says, nevertheless, we do know the premises. we're not 100% certain that we know them, but you can still know even without being 100% certain, according to Moore. Okay, so I hope that I've managed to distinguish the first and second objections well enough, but I don't want to keep going on and on about it, so you can just watch the video again if you didn't catch it the first time. So yeah, that's basically where the paper wraps up. We end up with that. It's a defense of the argument, and the argument is super simple and straightforward. Most of the things that he says are in defense of treating that argument as good. And if the argument is good, then we have a proof. We know that there's an external world. And we've also touched on this idea now. I haven't named it, but the name is fallibilism. It's the view that we can know things even though we're not infallible in our knowledge. So fallibilism tells us that we might know that we have hands even though we can't rule out that there's an evil demon. So that's something that we're going to come back to in a couple lectures, in a couple readings when we start reading Jim Pryor's The Skeptic and the Dogmatist. He's really following on the heels of Moore and trying to explain how it is that that our perceptual knowledge can exist even in the face of doubt, or in the face of the possibility that we're wrong. Okay. All right, that's it for today. Thanks. See you next time.